The world's most famous French cognac was built by an Irishman who never planned to make a single drop. Ireland, the late 17th century, a land of extraordinary beauty and extraordinary cruelty. In 1691, the Treaty of Limerick was signed. It was supposed to be a deal. Irish Catholic soldiers who had fought against the forces of William of Orange would be allowed to sail to France with their honor intact. Their rights would be protected, but the British tore the treaty apart. In its place came the penal laws, a systematic campaign to strip Irish Catholics of their land, their rights, and their futures. They couldn't vote, they couldn't own property, they couldn't hold office. They were strangers in their own country. And so, roughly 20,000 Irish soldiers made a choice. They boarded ships and sailed for France. History would call them the Wild Geese, a generation of exiles who scattered across the armies of Europe, never to return home. Many of these wild geese rose to extraordinary prominence. A MacMahon would become president of France. Bernardo O'Higgins would become the liberator of Chile. Admiral William Brown from County Mayo would become the father of the Argentine Navy. But one wild goose would build something that endures to this very day. Richard Hennessy was born in 1724 at Ballymacmoy House, a modest estate near the village of Killavulin, on the banks of the Blackwater River in County Cork. His family were Gaelic Irish Catholics, people of some standing, descended from old Irish stock, but now trapped under a regime that wanted them gone. Growing up, Richard had two choices: submit to a life of nothing, or leave. At 19 years old, he chose to leave. He packed what little he had and sailed for France. He would never see Ireland again. When Richard arrived in France, he did what countless Irish exiles before him had done. He picked up a musket. He enlisted in Dillon's regiment of the Irish Brigade, a unit of the French army made up almost entirely of Irish exiles, serving under King Louis XV. These men weren't just soldiers. They were refugees turned warriors, fighting for a country that wasn't theirs, in a war that wasn't theirs, because the country that was theirs didn't want them. On the 11th of May, 1745, Richard Hennessy found himself standing on one of the most famous battlefields in European history, Fontenoy, in what is now Belgium. 1/4 of the Irish Brigade's officers were killed or wounded that day. The brigade suffered 656 casualties. It was the bloodiest single day in their history. But for Richard Hennessy, the battlefields of France gave him something unexpected. They brought him to the Charente region, a quiet, sun-drenched stretch of southwestern France, where the vineyards seemed to go on forever, and where the locals had been perfecting something remarkable for centuries. They called it eau de vie, the water of life, what the rest of the world would come to know as cognac. A soldier's drink became a soldier's obsession. After years of service, Richard Hennessy hung up his uniform. But the question facing every retired soldier was the same then as it is now. What do you do next? In 1757, Richard and his cousin James traveled to Ostend in Flanders, modern-day Belgium, to learn the art of trade. He had tasted what the Charente region could produce. Now he needed to learn how to sell it. Then, in 1763, he married Ellen Barrett, a woman with connections to some of Ireland's most prominent Catholic families. She was reportedly related to the great political philosopher Edmund Burke. It was a match that gave Richard both a partner and a foothold into a wider network. In 1765, Richard and Ellen settled permanently in the town of Cognac, on the banks of the river Charente. With loans from Parisian banks and two business partners named Connolly and Arthur, Richard began trading in eau de vie from his home. Maison Hennessy was born, and his timing could not have been better. Europe was in the grip of a cognac boom. The 7 Years' War had created a severe shortage of rum, and the continent was thirsty for alternatives. In Ireland, customs duties on continental spirits were far lower than those in Great Britain, making cognac an affordable luxury. Demand was exploding. Richard began shipping barrels to Dublin, London, and Flanders. He even had clients at the court of King Louis himself, including the Prince of Soubise. But make no mistake, in the 1770s, Hennessy was still a small operation, a minor house in a crowded market. In 1776, Richard moved to Bordeaux, hoping to expand through partnerships there. He was a soldier who had learned to trade, but he wasn't yet a mogul. The business needed something more. Building a business from nothing demanded the same grit that had kept him alive on the battlefield. And Richard Hennessy had grit in abundance. In 1789, France tore itself apart. The revolution swept through the country like a wildfire, upending every institution, every hierarchy, every certainty. For the Hennessy family, it was a catastrophe. Richard's son, James, who had been increasingly running the business, was caught in the political chaos. As a foreigner and a man with connections to the old regime, he was vulnerable. James was forced to flee France and take refuge in his father's ancestral homeland of Ireland. It looked like the end. Everything Richard had spent decades building seemed destined to be swallowed by the fires of revolution. But the Hennessy spirit was not so easily broken. The revolution, for all its destruction, also shattered the old establishment. The great families and institutions that had dominated the cognac trade were weakened, creating space for ambitious newcomers to rise. James returned to France, and he made a move that would change everything. In the final decade of the 18th century, the Hennessy family forged two strategic marriages with the Martels, one of the oldest and most respected cognac houses in the region. In 1795, James married Marthe Martel. These alliances transformed Hennessy credibility. In 1794, the first barrels of Hennessy cognac crossed the Atlantic to New York. The American market had opened, but Richard Hennessy would not live to see the full scale of what he had started. On the 8th of October, 1800, at the age of 76, the Irish soldier who had fled Cork with nothing died in France. He died just as his house was finally becoming great. The man who planted the seed never sat beneath the tree. What Richard Hennessy started, his son James ran with, and James ran hard. Under his leadership, Hennessy expanded aggressively. London, New York, Russia. By 1818, the brand was no longer a regional player, it was going global. In 1804, Hennessy made a critical decision. They stopped shipping cognac in barrels and started bottling it themselves. It sounds simple, but it was revolutionary. It meant they controlled the product from grape to glass. No more counterfeiting, no more adulteration. Every bottle that left the house carried the Hennessy name and the Hennessy promise. Then, in 1806, the house brought in a man named Jean Filiou as its first master blender. This was the beginning of one of the most extraordinary partnerships in the history of spirits. The Filiou family would serve as Hennessy's master blenders for over 200 years, 8 consecutive generations of one family, perfecting a single craft. In 1817, the Prince Regent of Britain, the future King George IV, made a special request. He asked Hennessy to create a cognac that was, in his words, very superior, old, and pale. The result was the VSOP, a designation that didn't just name a product, it named a category. By the 1840s, Hennessy had become the world's leading exporter of brandy, a status it has never lost. Then came Maurice Hennessy, Richard's great-grandson and fourth-generation leader of the house. In 1865, Maurice introduced a star-based classification system for cognac quality. It became the global industry standard. Hennessy's 3-star blend is what we know today as VS, very special. But Maurice wasn't finished. In 1870, he asked his cellar master, Émile Filiou, to create something truly exceptional, a cognac made from long-aged eau de vie, reserved originally for family and friends. They called it XO, extra old. It would become the most iconic designation in all of cognac. In the 20th century, the 5th-generation descendant, Killian Hennessy, transformed the brand into a global luxury powerhouse. He visited China in 1946, a relationship that would eventually make the country the world's second-largest cognac market. In 1971, he orchestrated a merger with Moet et Chandon, creating Moet Hennessy. And in 1987, that entity merged with Louis Vuitton to create LVMH, the world's largest luxury conglomerate. Killian Hennessy remained on the company's advisory board until his death in 2010. He was 103 years old. One exiled soldier's desperate gamble had become a 250-year dynasty that defines luxury worldwide. Today, Hennessy sells over 100 million bottles a year. In more than 130 countries, it controls roughly 60% of the American cognac market alone. The brand has been referenced in more hip-hop songs than almost any other product on earth, from Tupac to Nas to Drake to Beyoncé. It sits as comfortably in a VIP lounge in Manhattan as it does in a family home in Cork. It is, by any measure, one of the most recognizable luxury brands the world has ever produced, and yet, at its heart, it's still the story of one man. An eighth-generation Hennessy, Maurice Richard Hennessy, still serves as a global ambassador for the brand. He is a direct descendant of the boy from Ballymacmoy who left County Cork with nothing. That bottle being poured, it carries the DNA of a 19-year-old Irish exile who had nothing but a soldier's courage and a taste for brandy. Richard Hennessy didn't just build a brand, he turned exile into empire, war into wine, and an Irishman's grief into France's greatest gift to the world.